NASCAR is not only one of the biggest sports attractions in America, but one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the world, anchored by tales of family legacy and the thrill of visceral, close-quarters competition, where a matter of inches could be the difference between glory and grief. But this family-friendly, sponsor-courting, rights fees-generating, multi-billion-dollar industry didn't start out as the brainchild of corporate suits and official governing bodies. No, NASCAR had outlaw origins. A fugitive spirit that many downplayed for years in the name of maintaining NASCAR's respectability. But the truth of NASCAR's desperado days is a tale of bootleggers on twisting roads in the dead of night, the lawlessness of early stock car racing, and drivers who were fed up with shady promoters, pervasive law enforcement, and a world that refused to take them seriously. From its origins in the hills of Appalachia during Prohibition, to its stock car evolution, all the way through to the Daytona 500, the event that legitimized NASCAR and set the organization on the path towards American cultural permanence, the story of NASCAR is bigger than motorsports, and its fathers are more numerous than any one man. This is RCR Stories, the outlaw origins of NASCAR. 1945. A teenager in the jagged hills of North Carolina finds himself in a high-speed chase with alcohol tax agents, who the locals had taken to calling revenuers. The kid had initially avoided law enforcement with a move he hadn't exactly invented, but a move that had become one of his signatures: the bootleg turn, in which he'd throw his car into second and spin the rear end 180 degrees before bolting off in the other direction. Nobody in the area did it as smoothly as him, and nobody infuriated law enforcement quite like he could. But when the kid looked ahead, he could see them waiting. A police blockade, with boards and barrels blocking the path forward. A bootleg turn wasn't going to get it done this time. He was trapped, with nowhere to go. So it was time for Plan B. With the flick of a switch, a red light activated on his grill. Another activated the sound of a police siren that pierced through the North Carolina night. As the revenuers heard the siren and saw the lights, they quickly moved the boards and barrels out of the path of their fellow officer. It wasn't until they saw the youthful face in the light of their cars that they realized they'd been duped. The kid fought the law, and he won. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. It was a dangerous game for a grown man, much less for a teenager. But his story wasn't unique. It was the story of any number of families in his area for the last 25 years. When the 18th Amendment prohibiting the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol went into effect in 1920, people didn't exactly stop drinking, nor did they stop illegally transporting it once Prohibition was repealed in 1933. And this was for two reasons. For one, repealing Prohibition mostly just kicked it back to the states, who would decide whether or not to honor it. Meaning that even after Prohibition was struck down by the 21st Amendment, there remained a lot of dry states and dry counties. The second reason was that even in areas where you could drink, produce, and sell alcohol, not everybody wanted to pay taxes on that alcohol. And to be fair, the government didn't exactly make it easy. The taxes were excessive, and that's if you could even get licensed to produce or sell alcohol in the first place. It was like the government was making up for 13 years of lost taxes by just gouging anybody who dared to make anything stronger than Listerine. Naturally, bootleggers and moonshiners realized that if they could get around paying these taxes, they would have a competitive advantage over companies who had to charge twice as much to make up for all the revenue they were paying Uncle Sam. But successful bootlegging meant you needed skilled drivers in heavily tuned and modified cars to not only get the hooch where it needed to go, but to avoid the long, federally funded arm of the law in the process. And so the bootleggers reached out to the best drivers Appalachia had to offer. Law enforcement in Georgia was well acquainted with a 14-year-old kid named Carl D. Lloyd C., who just went by the name Lloyd C. This kid had been running whiskey up and down the hairpin curves of the Georgia mountains for as long as he could get a set of wheels under him. He'd been born the month before Prohibition went into effect, and now, in 1934, just 1 year after Prohibition was repealed, he was running whiskey in the northeast Georgia mountains. And Lloyd C. was becoming more brazen than ever. As author Jay Busby would write in his article, Hellfire and White Lightning, C would park himself at a 24-hour service station in his hometown of Dawsonville, Georgia, to wait for the payphone to ring. The call would come through, at which point C would take the person's order for apples. And then C would make his pickup, but he always kept his grip low on the steering wheel in order to spin the car around in a single motion if he encountered the law. Just spin that bad boy around and go tearing off into the night. And he didn't actually encounter the law as often as you would assume he would, and this is because he had been driving a Ford V8, a popular choice of bootleggers, and frankly, a lot of outlaws at the time. In fact, Ford's flathead V8 was so beloved among outlaws that John Dillinger himself wrote a letter to Henry Ford to thank him for its creation. Now, while 85 horsepower might not sound like a lot, in 1934 you might as well have been riding a lightning bolt bare-assed. The Ford V8 provided enough reliable power to escape the law and enough durability to withstand the hard driving it took to do so. C would be described in Busby's article as kind, respectful, and even shy, which makes him something of a paradox. He made his living breaking the law, but his innate likability seemed to earn him some leeway with the police. In one notable story, C was stopped for speeding in the middle of one of his whiskey runs. In a rush to get moving again, he tossed the police officer 2 $10 bills. The officer looked at him and said, "Hell, Lloyd, the fine ain't but $10. To which C responded, "I know it, but I ain't gonna have time to stop next time. I'm paying in advance." It was said that revenuers were only ever able to catch Lloyd C. by shooting out his tires, and even then, in all the years of whiskey running, they only ever caught him 8 times, and each time he managed to be back on the streets in relatively short order. Perhaps that likability inspired judges to give him 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 8th chances, I'm not sure. But what does seem certain, at least, is that Lloyd C. was the embodiment of the nature versus nurture argument. Because while he seemed to have a good heart, he was raised in a family that author Neil Thompson, in his book, Driving with the Devil, describes as, quote, "a dark, angry, embittered family of drunken, felonious recidivists, men who taunted the law, their women, and one another." End quote. As Thompson notes, the men in Lloyd C.'s family tended to meet violent ends, either by automobiles, booze, guns, or all three. So it's not really surprising that Lloyd ended up in the family business. And moonshining was a family business, because the only whiskey runner in Dawsonville, Georgia, who was as famous as Lloyd C., was his cousin, 14-year-old Roy Hall. Roy Hall was said to have lived by a simple phrase: "When it's time to go, I'll go. Until then, I have nothing to lose." Friends of Lloyd C. noted that he couldn't read or write, but was so gifted at the wheel that he didn't have to. And you could say the same of Roy Hall, who went to school until age 10 before dropping out to move with his uncle to Atlanta. Once in the big city, he fell into crime by helping another one of his cousins in an illegal gambling operation. Now, you might not think running a gambling operation with your cousin would lead to moonshining, but that's basically how it panned out for old Roy, who took to driving like a fish to a hooked worm. However, while Thompson's book describes Hall as being, quote, obscenely handsome and absurdly cocky, end quote, that charisma didn't exactly endear him to law enforcement the way it did his cousin Lloyd C., because his charm wasn't the same good old boy charm. It was more of an outlaw, bad boy type of vibe. Hall would be captured for running whiskey and thrown behind bars on multiple occasions, and while the law never seemed to hold him for very long, the law could hold him. But boys like Lloyd C. and Roy Hall were emblematic of how much bolder the bootleggers were getting, because this wasn't sport, it was survival. And while nothing else could provide the visceral thrill of outrunning police, at a certain point, it stopped being enough. They wanted more. It wasn't even about the money, but about the desire to use these driving skills in a way that didn't involve being chased by the feds. In seeking an outlet for their talents, the cousins eventually reached the decision to give the stock car racing circuit a try. Stock car racing, which put production cars on oval-shaped courses, was becoming more popular in rural parts of the country in the 1930s, and it could be argued that this was due to bootleggers. You see, drivers like Lloyd C. and Roy Hall weren't like your typical racers who maybe only drove at the track. These boys were doing upwards of 3 runs per week at high speeds and under immense pressure. Not only did these guys know how to drive, they knew how to put on a damn good show. So much so that word of mouth would bring patrons back the following week, and the week after, and the week after. Because make no mistake, there was a theatricality to bootlegger driving that, while not legal in competitive circuits, added to their appetite for boldness. You know, ignoring the more daring driver tactics like the bootleg turn, plenty of moonshine cars were modified in ambitiously ridiculous ways that turned law enforcement pursuits into a spectacle straight out of those old Wacky Races cartoons. Modifications to backfire a dense cloud of smoke at pursuers, or drop nails onto the road, or spill oil behind them on some snidely whiplash-type behavior. Some cars used flipping license plates, instantly finding a more graceful way of hiding that information than your average Facebook marketplace seller doing the old thumb redaction. Suspensions reinforced with additional springs, not simply to handle all the extra weight of the illegal whiskey being transported in the car, but to prevent the car from sagging, since a sagging car tended to be a dead giveaway that they were haulin' hooch. Windshield wipers were removed, and openings around the headlight housings were taped up because it was discovered that just these 2 changes could increase speed by an additional 10 miles an hour. In such close quarters, 10 miles an hour could be the difference between ruin and salvation. Basically, bootleggers knew how to go fast. They were quick thinking, and they could maneuver their cars like few on the road because they were intimately familiar with their vehicles and how they moved on unpredictable terrain. So that fearless spirit made them more exciting to watch, and they put on the kind of compelling show that people in rural areas didn't often see. And more promoters were starting to take notice. One such promoter was a racer himself, and he would be the one to get the entire ball rolling on a new age in stock car racing. William Henry Getty France Sr., or Bill France Sr., stood 6 feet 5 inches tall, so everyone just called him Big Bill. Races of all kinds, from boats to horses to stock cars, tended to be run by much smaller men, but Big Bill never let his size hold him back. In fact, while he never ran moonshine or whiskey himself, he might as well have for all the time he spent around fast cars. And like his whiskey-running contemporaries, he did it in lieu of going to school, as Bill France spent much of his youth skipping class to sneak off to drive laps in the family Model T until his father got off of work, at which point he'd make like Ferris Bueller and book it for home in the desperate attempt to get there first. The man loved cars and racing, having put working Ford engines into these basic wooden race cars he'd built with his own 2 hands when he was just 17, which makes me feel really self-conscious because at 17, my idea of performance tuning was changing the EQ sliders in Winamp. Remember Winamp? But for Bill France, that was all in the past. Now, he was fixated on one place, Daytona Beach, Florida. Since 1902, the Daytona Beach road course was a track renowned for its hard-packed sands and vast open stretches that allowed drivers to achieve land speed records. It was the ultimate destination for anyone who wanted to unlock the full potential of his car, and fearless drivers came from all over the world for a chance to make history on the course. At least until the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah became the new hot place to go if you wanted to land in the record books. And so the Daytona Beach City Council decided, hey, let's just hold races on this track instead. Now, by 1934, Big Bill was a 25-year-old married father, and he was making ends meet working in the automotive industry by running a service shop. The France family was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, so not only was running a service shop not exactly the kind of work Bill wanted to be doing, with those harsh Washington, D.C. winters, it wasn't even the type of climate he wanted to be doing it in, especially when you live in a place where all of your neighbors come to you to crank start their cars on winter mornings. So even though he could barely afford to move, he did it anyway, and took his family to Daytona Beach, on the premise that a talented mechanic wouldn't have a hard time landing a job somewhere. And Bill would eventually open his own service shop down there. But he didn't intend to remain a mechanic. Almost immediately, he started laying the foundation that would get him out of that line of work by making connections in the local racing community. For as large and as intimidating as Big Bill France was, he had a certain charm that endeared him even to people with whom he didn't see eye to eye. He became well known in the area because, well, he knew cars. It's important to remember that Bill France was a gearhead at a time where not everybody could relate, since not everybody had automobiles to work on, much less to race. But Big Bill was able to really speak to the people in these automotive enthusiast communities. So when the city council was planning the first stock car race to be held on the Daytona Beach course, Big Bill was in on that action. And on March 8th, 1936, Big Bill France achieved his goal of driving on the sands of Daytona Beach in a race that lasted 78 laps and 241 miles. He finished in 5th place, marking his entry into the world of motorsports proper. It was a triumph. It was a spectacle. It was a total disaster for the city of Daytona Beach. Yeah, sure, it was well attended, but the problem was that the event was so poorly organized that people were able to sneak onto the grounds before the race started, set up shop, and watch the entire thing for free. Not that they got a good show, since ruts had formed in the sands that ran so deep, drivers ended up getting stuck. Due to these conditions, the race, which was initially intended to run for 250 miles, stopped short at 241. And out of the 27 cars that entered, only 10 managed to finish, which sort of makes Big Bill's finish all the more impressive. But ultimately, the event lost the city of Daytona roughly $22,000, which is over $500,000 today. The only thing anybody knew for certain was that there was no chance anybody would ever sponsor another Daytona Beach race again. The next year, the Daytona Beach Elks Club sponsored the race, hopeful that drawing a huge crowd would earn them big money. Oh, wait, what? They lost money too? Really? Well, damn. Kind of makes for a crummy story, I guess. So wait, what was Big Bill up to during all this? Well, over this 2-year period, Bill France was paying his dues on the stock car circuit and getting paid virtually nothing in return. Put simply, stock car racing was a disorganized mess, governed, supposedly, by organizations with weird acronyms and dubious authority, and promoted by men who didn't seem to know how to pay their drivers fairly, much less promote an event honestly, and won by drivers whose only skill was that they had the money to afford a nicer car than everyone else. It wasn't just frustrating. It was disheartening. An ESPN feature on the legacy of Bill France and his family detailed his struggles as a stock car driver. Quote, "He despaired of lying promoters. Once, a race was billed as paying $500 to the winner. Bill finished third and collected only $10. How could that be if the winner got $500? Complaining to the promoter, Bill was told that the $500 was all hype to draw a crowd. The winner received only $50. If Big Bill France ever got to be a promoter, he was going to be fair, and he was going to pay what he promised, and he would find a way to equalize the competition so that talent mattered more than money." End quote. Stock car racers like Bill France struggled to be taken seriously, because stock cars weren't really seen as legitimate. AAA didn't like sponsoring them, and the biggest race, the Indy 500, was a bougie affair for the white glove wearing, handlebar mustache growing, gray poupon slathering lords and ladies of society's upper crust. A crust that rimmed the decaying pizza known as the Great Depression. But near the end of the 1930s, something began to change. Word was that stock car racing was catching on north of Florida, and the drivers were these daring, reckless boys who cut their teeth on the moonshining circuit, which wasn't a real circuit, but might as well have been. These were exciting races, and attendance was beginning to rival so-called legitimate racing. In 1938, Atlanta's Lakewood Speedway hosted the first major stock car race. Naturally, others had been held, but this was the first one to largely exceed the confines of rural fairgrounds and poorly organized beach racing events. This was in front of 20,000 screaming, cheering, paying customers, and the winner was a wiry, wily 18-year-old kid named Lloyd C., whose cousin, Roy Hall, finished 5th. This confirmed what Bill France already knew, that stock car racing could be viable and it could draw audiences. And, wanting to be the type of promoter the sport desperately needed, Big Bill decided to stage his own race on the Daytona Beach course. The only problem was that he needed the money to fund it. As the story goes, Big Bill tried to sweet-talk a Midwestern racing promoter into sponsoring the event. But when Bill went to make the call, he found that he didn't even have a quarter. So he decided to call collect to try and charge the call to the businessman receiving it. But the promoter refused to accept the charges because he had no idea who in the hell Bill France was. Spiraling, Bill sort of offhandedly complained about his hard luck to a friend of his, whose nightclubs were funded by bootlegging. This small-time gangster agreed to sponsor the race as long as he didn't have to do the work of actually setting it all up and promoting it. And so it was that Big Bill France's first promotional endeavor was funded by moonshining, and the resulting race was the first to actually make money on that Daytona Beach course. Little by little, Bill France was altering the reputation of stock car racing into a more mainstream attraction. At least that was the goal, to separate it from the provincial mentality that defined its earlier days. People smashing into each other because they couldn't see through all the mud, cars overheating from dust and dirt-clogged radiators, and drivers strapping themselves down with rope because commercial seatbelts didn't exist yet for cars, people spitting out dirt and rocks and teeth. That was not the type of racing Big Bill wanted to promote. He wanted a bigger, grander spectacle, but that would require attracting the best racers the sport had to offer, and men who would basically recruit those drivers. Enter Raymond Parks, the man that author Neil Thompson described as, quote, the first person to put together a formalized, legitimate racing team, end quote. Raymond Parks would have been just 25 years old, by which point he'd been fending for himself for 11 years. The eldest of 16 children, he's what people today would call a parentified child, made to raise his younger siblings in between working to contribute to the household income. It was all too much for Parks to bear, and it got worse when he landed himself in jail at age 14 after getting caught buying corn liquor for his father, who sent the kid to go get it for him. While in county lockup, Parks met a moonshiner and decided, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, and left home to go apprentice under that moonshiner once he was released from jail. But he wasn't just running booze, he was learning how to operate his own still, while also operating a numbers racket on the side with the help of his young cousin, who dropped out of school and moved to Atlanta with his uncle. During that time, Parks became a prodigy in the business of bootlegging, setting up a network of stills, each producing hundreds of gallons of hooch that sold for so much money that he was able to hire workers to make the booze and drivers to run it. With the money he made, he invested in a service station owned by a 34-year-old mechanic named Red Vote. Why go into business with this guy? Well, Red Vote was known as the bootlegger's mechanic, and you could say that he's partially the reason Parks' business ventures went as smoothly as they did, because Red Vote was regarded as one of, if not the, best in his field, and you needed a mechanic like this if your business involved cars. And, seeing the growing appeal of stock car racing, Raymond Parks decided he wanted to expand his automotive ventures. But unlike Bill France, Parks didn't want to put on shows. He wanted in on the action. He wanted to form his own team. And once he made that decision, Red Vote was the man he wanted working on his cars. It was an easy choice, yet Parks' choice in drivers was even easier. He called two of the top whiskey runners in Georgia, Lloyd C. and Roy Hall. Two men who also happened to be his cousins. When Lloyd C. won that stock car race at Lakewood Speedway in 1938, it was on his cousin Ray Parks' team, and for the next 3 years, Parks' team was formidable, claiming victories at High Point, Lakewood Speedway, and Daytona. However, for all their success, the team still wasn't complete. Enter a 23-year-old driver by the name of Red Byron. Robert Red Byron had been racing since 1932, when he was just 17 years old, because never let it be said that race car drivers don't start young. He was a veteran of Talladega and a fixture of races in his adopted hometown of Anniston, Alabama, and he developed into an up-and-coming prospect. A man of Red Byron's skill was pretty much destined to land at Lakewood Speedway, and it was there that Raymond Parks and Red Vogt would take notice of his skill and offer him a position on the team, which he accepted. Suddenly, Parks's team had 2 Reds. Bad news when you're opening a brand new box of popsicles, but great news when your race team needs 2 experts of their respective crafts. Parks's team would gain further acclaim, culminating in Byron winning his first major stock car victory in July of 1941. As the sport grew in popularity, Big Bill France began recruiting drivers to race in the Carolinas and in Virginia. In particular, Bill was amazed by Lloyd C., who had earned the nickname of Lightning. Even in professional driving circles, cars generally didn't move the way Lightning Lloyd's did, and it spoke to his almost supernatural gift for handling cars, managing turns, and the iron-willed endurance that elite racing demanded. In one instance at Daytona Beach, Lloyd flipped his car 3 times, yet still managed to finish 4th. Then there was the time he steered his car onto its side and lifted the wheels off the ground, smoothly gliding along like caramel down an endless, slothful tower of ice cream, and doing it one-handed. Lightning Lloyd C. was both showman and athlete. And Big Bill wasn't just a casual, distant admirer. You could say he was a rival. In August 1941, C defeated France at the 160-mile Daytona Beach race, in which Big Bill managed to place 7th. This, despite the fact that C began the race in 15th. He would close the distance before the end of the first lap, from which he proceeded to lead the rest of the way. For Bill France, it was a tough defeat, but a fair one. While Big Bill was still dedicated to racing, as time wore on, he became more like the Nick Fury of NASCAR, with the goal of putting together a group under which to organize this entire enterprise. But Raymond Parks and his team weren't the only people with whom he wanted to meet. No, he wanted every major authority figure in the world of stock car racing under one roof, to give regulatory shape to this sport that was becoming their very livelihood. It was time to have a little meeting, but not before experiencing some not-so-little tragedies. 1941 was a banner year for Raymond Parks' racing team. Roy Hall was among the points leaders in the AAA Stock Car Championship. Red Byron had brought in his first major victory for the team, and Lloyd C. would go on to win 3 races in under 2 weeks, including his victory in August over Bill France, and his cousin Roy Hall, who also competed in that Daytona Beach race. Everything was leading to a championship contest at Lakewood Speedway on September 1st. A 100-mile Labor Day race with a grand prize of about $450, which is close to $10,000 in 2025. There was just one little hiccup. Lightning Lloyd C. didn't get there in time. As part of his manic racing schedule, C was in a race up in High Point, North Carolina the night before, and he had to hop in his car and get to Georgia in time for the Labor Day race. But the drive was long enough that he ultimately didn't get there in time for qualifying. So while he would still be able to compete, he would just have to start in last place. However, as Daytona proved, Lloyd C. never met a gap he couldn't close. And I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere, but damned if I'm gonna be the one to make it. This was the biggest race of C's career. A championship race on his arguable home course with some of the best stock car drivers in the country. Yet unlike at Daytona, once the flag dropped, it would take a lot longer than the first lap for C to find his footing. Throughout the race, he was neck and neck with Bob Flock, a well-known racer with his own moonshiner past that was so prolific, law enforcement once chased him off the track mid-race. But here, Flock was firmly in control. until the 35th lap when Lightning Lloyd took the lead. The crowd was on the edge of their seats going into the last lap when it looked like Flock would retake the lead. But whether it was an ill-timed maneuver, mechanical failure, or just bad luck, Flock found himself crashing into a wall. Lloyd C. had just claimed another Lakewood victory. And in some ways, it was poignant that his biggest win was against a fellow moonshiner like Bob Flock, since it's unlikely anybody understood bootleggers and moonshiners quite like other bootleggers and moonshiners, because it's hard to understand the circumstances that make crime a reasonable prospect for survival. And in fact, some of these racers never stopped running moonshine. Lloyd C. was one of these men, and it would create problems that went beyond the boundaries of an oval racetrack. Earlier that summer, C. had bought some 50-pound bags of sugar for use in distilling moonshine, but he didn't have the money to pay for it at the time, so he had the shop charge it to the account of one of his other cousins, an ill-tempered man named Woodrow Anderson. Lloyd and Woodrow had run moonshine together for years, interrupted only by Woodrow's 2 terms in prison. When he discovered his account had been charged $120, Woodrow was madder than 10 hells, so on September 1st, with Lloyd C. in bed, sleeping off his victory at Lakewood, Woodrow Anderson went banging on Lloyd's door in the middle of the night to demand his money back. After all, Lloyd had just won a bunch of money, right? Lloyd's brother Jim answered the door, and Woodrow demanded they get in his Ford Model A to go for a ride. Lloyd got dressed and got in the car, along with his brother Jim. On that dark September evening, Woodrow drove the brothers to his father's house, teasing Lloyd about the number on his car. Lloyd C. had typically raced with the number 7, but at Lakewood that night, his car wore the number 13. Woodrow wanted to know if Lloyd thought the number was lucky. When Lloyd answered that he supposed it was, Woodrow was said to have told him, "Don't be too sure of that." As they pulled into his driveway, Woodrow claimed he needed to put water in the radiator of his car. The Model A came to a stop, and Woodrow popped the hood. But instead of filling the radiator, he pulled out a .32 caliber pistol from his pocket and began viciously beating Lloyd. When Jim tried to stop him, Jim was hit in the neck and the right lung. No sound of a struggle, just the nightmarish cacophony of gunfire and hard landings. Yet somehow, Jim was still alive, and so was Lloyd. Beaten and bloody, but still wanting to help his brother, Lloyd stepped towards Woodrow. In the third part of his remarkable series on stock car racing and moonshine, titled Hellfire and White Lightning, from which information on this encounter is sourced, author J. Busby details what happened next. Quote, "Committed, Woodrow turned the gun on Lloyd and, without uttering another word, fired, hitting Lloyd straight in the chest. The bullet ripped through his heart, and Lloyd fell backward onto the dirt. Woodrow loomed above him. 'Why?' Lloyd whispered in his final moments. 'Why do you shoot me?' 'Damn you,' Woodrow growled. 'You know what I shot you for.' Lloyd lay in the red dirt, begging for water. Woodrow didn't even acknowledge him. C lifted his head, looking at his brother, his last thoughts of his cousin and mechanic, Raymond Parks. 'Tell Raymond.' And then Lloyd died. Woodrow dug in Lloyd's pocket and found the money he'd won at Lakewood, plus a silver dollar Lloyd carried for luck. Woodrow counted out $120 in blood-stained bills and threw the rest back at Jim. End quote. Woodrow Anderson would later tell authorities that Lloyd and Jim had attacked him first, but the police weren't buying it. Jim had lived to tell the tale of what actually happened, allegedly. So Woodrow Anderson would be indicted for murder, and while the first jury failed to reach a verdict, he would be convicted by the second and sentenced to life in prison, before being paroled 7 years later, because justice is a fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel better about living in a society that doesn't make any sense. No, sorry. C's death was front-page news, and the racing community was devastated beyond imagining. Here was the future of racing, a one-of-a-kind driver, and an all-around good guy who people genuinely seemed to love, and he was cut down just 3 months short of his 22nd birthday. Yet for all his success in racing and all of his efforts in bootlegging, C's family didn't have the money to bury him or to hire lawyers to help with the prosecution of Woodrow Anderson, so Big Bill stepped up, along with Bob Flock and his fellow race car driving brother Fonty Flock, to hold a benefit race at the track that cemented C's legend, Atlanta's Lakewood Speedway. The $832 they raised would be worth more than $18,000 in 2025, but no amount of money could compensate for the loss of Lloyd C. Devastated by the death of his cousin, Roy Hall would drive like a man possessed, and by the end of 1941, he would win the National Stock Car Championship, a trophy that had eluded his cousin in life, which could now only be shared in spirit. Lloyd C. died over some bags of sugar, but at a deeper level, his death was the result of the chaotic forces of his livelihood, a way of life that was commonplace then, but no less dangerous for how commonplace it was. In a way, he fulfilled the grim prophecy of his family, the men of whom died young, from booze, guns, or cars. Or maybe all three. The finest driver Georgia had yet seen belonged to the ages, and the memories of die-hard race fans and historians in the decades to come. But while undoubtedly legendary by any standard, the name Lloyd C. would never achieve the cultural significance of a Dale Earnhardt. But Bill France never forgot his old rival. Later in his life, Big Bill was said to have remarked that Lloyd C. was the best pure driver he'd ever seen, and supposedly went as far as to add, quote, "Dale Earnhardt is the best driver I've seen since Lloyd C. Lloyd was the best." End quote. But the racing world, much less the people in Lloyd C.'s life, had time to mourn him, as the United States was drawn into the Second World War. This meant that not only was automobile production brought to an unceremonious halt, so was all stock car racing. Yet in some ways, Red Byron was more prepared for the war than any of his colleagues. You see, when he won that big stock car race in July 1941, he hadn't even been racing full-time. He did it while on a 2-day leave from his Air Force training. He was preparing to serve his country, all while building up his reputation as one of the hottest up-and-coming drivers on the stock car circuit. And who's to say how the rest of his season might have gone, had the Japanese not attacked Pearl Harbor on that Sunday, December 7th of 1941. Once the United States officially joined the war, Byron went to serve as a flight engineer on a consolidated B-24 Liberator, a heavy-duty bomber built by the same company revered by outlaws and stock car racers alike, Ford. Over the next 2 years, Byron would fly 58 combat missions, which is wild enough, but it takes on an almost mythic scale when you consider that the average number of combat missions flown at the time was 20. He even acted as a tail gunner at times. And not unlike his time driving for Raymond Parks, Red Byron shone brightly enough on his own, but he was worth his weight in gold as part of a team. From everything I've read about him, it seems he genuinely wanted to help wherever he could and cared about the people he was serving with. Case in point, when the wife of one of his crewmates went into labor, Red Byron offered to take his place on a bombing mission in the Pacific. It was his 58th combat mission, and it would be his last. It was a fairly standard bombing run, at least as standard as the high-pressure situations of war could possibly accommodate. But then, Red Byron was used to pressure on the racetrack. He was used to living dangerously. So when one of the bombs in the Liberator got stuck, because Ford, it was up to Byron to get in there and knock it loose. Somehow, he was able to cut it free over their target, the island where Japanese Imperial Army and Navy troops were stationed. Despite the constant threat of anti-aircraft weapons and the plane whipping by at speeds of over 200 miles an hour, Byron had succeeded in deploying the bomb. But as it fell towards its target, there was a sudden flash and an unmistakable burst of heat. Whether the bomb malfunctioned or anti-aircraft weapons had struck it, the bomb had exploded mere moments after it began its descent. The bomb bay doors were still open, and Byron was still exposed. The shrapnel from the resulting explosion tore into his left leg, leaving him bleeding out on the floor of the plane. Unsure that the plane could even make it back, but determined to save his comrade, the pilot decided that rather than landing, surrendering, and taking their chances as Japanese POWs, they would try to make the 600-mile return flight while the crew did their best to keep Byron alive. Miraculously, not only would the plane just barely make it back, but Red Byron would survive the mission. But tragically, his left leg had been permanently debilitated, and it was only because of his refusal that the doctors didn't amputate the leg altogether. Byron could keep his leg, but he would have to have it braced for the rest of his life. His racing career was at an end, and the war would follow suit just a year later. Yet, in the same way the auto industry experienced a boom after all the boys returned home, stock car racing also saw its fortunes resume, largely because people were desperate to experience things again with their loved ones. For a while, Red Byron had to watch from the sidelines, witnessing the highs and lows of his old friends. Roy Hall, that handsome, charismatic devil, was at the ground floor when stock car racing had resumed in 1945. In the first race back, he beat Bill France to win the first ever race at the Seminole Speedway in Castleberry, Florida. However, he would also be temporarily banned from his home course of Lakewood Speedway due to all those prior arrests for running whiskey. But this is where Hall's charisma saved him, because over the years, he had become an exceedingly popular racer. When the 30,000 fans in attendance learned that Roy Hall wouldn't be competing, a riot nearly broke out. It got so bad that the authorities had to let him race just to keep the peace, and he would win that race and be declared the winner of the 1945 season, before going on to Daytona in 1946, where he would have his rematch with Bill France. Big Bill wanted to prove he could still hang on what was arguably his home course, but whether it was Hall's natural talent finally maturing, or a new fire being lit in him after Lloyd's passing, Big Bill just couldn't keep up. When he lost at Daytona, he decided to give up on driving and focus on promoting full-time. Yet despite all his success, and despite the ongoing support of men like master mechanic Red Vogt and his cousin Raymond Parks, Roy Hall remained rudderless after Lloyd Seay's death. He fell deeper into lawlessness and, in 1946, committed a bank robbery that saw him heist $40,000, which is over $600,000 today. He was arrested and thrown in prison, where he would sit for the next 3 years, missing out on arguably his prime racing years. But the reality of that post-war period was that racing remained as unregulated as ever. IndyCar drivers and fans tended to look down their nose at stock car racing as a sport for junkyard cars, and the sport still had its share of shady promoters who'd hold races, promise a big purse for the competitors, and then take the money and run. And the promoters who actually did do right by their drivers still ran organizations that each had their own sets of rules and regulations that shared no consistency with one another, so that every driver and racing fan would have to learn a new set of rules to either compete or just follow along. You had governing bodies like the American Stock Car Racing Association, the United Stock Car Racing Club, and the Stock Car Auto Racing Society, who at least had the benefit of their acronym being metal as hell. But different organizations would crown their own national champions, so that there was never a real undisputed best driver. It's sort of like when a local diner puts out a sign that their pancakes are world famous. Yeah, sure, people in Azerbaijan have totally heard about the pancakes at the Kunkelman Diner in Lower Garbageport, Pennsylvania. Frustrated by this, Big Bill decided to create his own sanctioning body called the National Championship Stock Car Circuit in 1947, with the tagline, "We're the fastest that run. Run the fastest." Yeah, let's just go with that. That's good. It has the same energy as those influencers who go on podcasts with those fake motivational phrases like, you don't have to work your job. What you gotta do is job your work. And then the host has to pretend that they just had their mind blown, like a Midwestern dad finding out that Billy Ocean wasn't white. But even this governing body wasn't enough to truly organize the disparate factions of stock car racing, because there was no way to enforce a consistent set of rules, not when there wasn't any singular body of regulatory oversight. So Big Bill had an idea, and it was the kind of thing that only somebody of Bill France's authority and ambition could have attempted. So Big Bill France knew that all the most important figures in stock car racing read Speed Age magazine. So he placed an ad in the publication inviting promoters, drivers, and businessmen alike to join him at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach, Florida, for a meeting to decide the future of regulated stock car racing. It was an odd choice of location considering this was a hotel where Al Capone supposedly met with his associates during the war. But then it was kind of fitting when you consider who funded the meeting. That moonshining outlaw Raymond Parks wasn't convinced anybody was going to show up, nor did he really believe that if people did show up, they would take any of it seriously. But he ponied up the money to fund the meeting for Bill France. After all, if stock car racing was ever going to become more than a regional enterprise, they had to do something to try and regulate it, right? And so, on Sunday, December 14th, 1947, some of the most important figures in stock car racing arrived at the rooftop ebony room of the Streamline Hotel. Among the people joining Big Bill at the meeting were Ohio-based promoter Jack Peters and his business partner Ed Bruce, two men with an interest in making a roadster circuit part of this potential new organization. There were representatives of the United Stock Car Racing Club, the American Stock Car Racing Association, Speed Age magazine, and race car drivers like 26-year-old hotshot Marshall Teague and brothers Bob and Fonty Flock, the two racers who'd helped promote the Lloyd C. Memorial Benefit Race 6 years earlier. There was also Raymond Parks and his team, Red Vogt and Red Byron, since Roy Hall was making his home in a prison cell. Poignantly, December 14th, 1947, would have been Lloyd C.'s 28th birthday. All told, approximately 35 men attended the meeting over the 3-day period. Dark liquor was flowing. Cigars were lit. Smoke filled the room as Secretary Mildred Ayres took minutes. Glasses clinked, that traitorous sound that would get you flagged by revenuers in the foothills of Appalachia. Except now, the clinking was part of a call to attention. Big Bill drew all eyes to him and opened the discussion by declaring, in part, quote, "Every track and every area has a national champion of every type of racing. This has so confused sports writers that they give up in disgust after trying to give the public an accurate picture." End quote. Big Bill was preaching to the choir. Yet while everyone could agree that something had to be done, nobody could seem to agree on just what. Raymond Parks was so convinced nothing would get done that he didn't even sit at the table with everyone else, instead choosing to go talk to some women seated at the bar. As the meeting progressed, Bill made the argument for Sunday shows, which then led into a debate over a potential national point standing. And it was something of a coincidence that the hotel was called the Streamline, because streamlining the sport was exactly the purpose, although the first day didn't make as much progress as Bill probably hoped it would. However, the second day was better. At least enough so that the two Reds, Byron and Vogt, went to the bar to go get Parks to convince him to join in, since actual headway was being made in the discussions. Over the final 2 days of the meetings, a pragmatic approach began to take hold. Sunday races made sense because drivers and racing fans worked during the week. There was also a movement not to deviate from regular stock cars. Vehicles you could find in any neighborhood and cul-de-sac in America. Cars outside every office building with tall windows and short-tempered managers. This would be the equalization Big Bill wanted. Leveling the playing field so that, as Bill put it, a regular racing car could be competition to the rich guy. A national point system, meanwhile, would ensure that there would only be one national champion crowned at the end of each season in each division. One driver would be the undisputed best. There would be guaranteed purses, and no driver would be screwed over by here today, gone tomorrow promoters. But beyond this, there was debate over the various racing categories. The men mostly agreed on a modified class, while the Ohio boys Jack Peters and Ed Bruce argued for a roadster class, and a strictly stock category was agreed upon as well. But there were some catches. For one, the roadster class was voted down due to Southern fans being unlikely to vibe with cars they weren't all that familiar with. And strictly stock ran into similar issues due to how few new production stock cars were on the road in the immediate aftermath of the war. So a strictly stock series was temporarily put on hold. But from what I could find, there was no such issue with the modified division. So the race divisions were set, along with rules and regulations. All they needed to do now was come up with a name. Red Byron offered the name National Stock Car Racing Association, or NSCRA. Red Vogt, meanwhile, suggested the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR. It was put to a vote, and Red Byron's NSCRA was the winner. Naturally, Bill France was disappointed. He really liked the name NASCAR. Yet he didn't have a pretext for forcing a revote. Until suddenly, he recalled that, hey, wait a minute, there's already an NSCRA running in Georgia, so we can't use that name, or anything with that acronym. We have to have a revote. So the men considered other names, and it led to a stalemate in the room. Ed Bruce, who wanted to get the name vote over with so they could go back to talking about roadsters, put forward a motion to just go with NASCAR. His business partner, Jack Peters, who presumably also wanted to get back on the topic of roadsters, seconded the motion. And that was enough momentum to get the ball rolling in favor of Red Vote's suggestion, the one Bill France liked best. The national governing body of stock car racing would officially be the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR. But their work wasn't finished, because they had to decide on officers. As cited by ESPN in their 2022 article detailing the history of the Streamline Hotel meetings, Charlotte Observer Motorsports reporter Tom Higgins noted, quote, "Big Bill should have been a politician. His invitation list to those meetings was just the right mix of friends versus foes, and when they closed those meetings with officer elections, which also determined who got the most shares of ownership, who do you think convinced them to give Bill France Sr. the presidency of NASCAR and the most shares? Bill France Sr., that's who." End quote. Raymond Parks could hardly believe it. Bill France had corralled these men together, established a governing body, and convinced them all to sign away the lion's share of authority and ownership to him. However, it would take another 2 months for NASCAR to hold its first sanctioned race. On February 15th, 1948, the winning car, prepared and maintained by master mechanic Red Vote, crossed the finish line of that first race, and it was driven by his good friend, Red Byron. Yes, Byron had believed he would never race again due to his leg, but he never gave up hope that he would one day be able to race again. However, when Byron tried driving his Ford, the lack of mobility from his steel-braced left leg made the prospect seem virtually impossible. Until he worked alongside Red Vote to put their brains together to figure out a solution. Together, they made a contraption that was basically 2 stirrup pins that could be affixed to the clutch pedal. This way, they could essentially bolt Red Byron's leg to the clutch pedal. The problem here, however, was that Byron ultimately lacked the same amount of control as other drivers, and so the end result was that his car would flip upside down at times. But as he drove it more and more, Byron got the hang of this new contraption, and as Raymond Parks would recall, Byron was dead set on soldiering ahead, saying, quote, "This is working. Bolt it on there and let's go." End quote. Upon returning to racing in 1946, he won the Hankinson Memorial at Seminole Speedway in a victory over his teammate Roy Hall, just before Hall's bank robbery arrest. Another person Byron defeated in that race? Big Bill France, prior to his retirement from racing. And now, just 2 short years later, Red Byron was the winner of NASCAR's inaugural race. And not only would he claim that victory, he would go on to compete in the first series, the 52-race modified class, and become NASCAR's first champion. The war hero had come home a changed man, but he persevered through ingenuity, determination, and the type of courage you really sort of need to be a champion at anything. As 1948 came to a close, NASCAR's appeal was undeniable. A new era in American motorsports had finally arrived. Oh, the story's not over yet, not by a long shot. NASCAR was home to a growing influx of compelling race car drivers, some new and some older. When the Strictly Stock Series made its debut in the summer of 1949, one of the men to compete was Roy Hall, newly released from prison. He would finish in 6th place before moving on to compete in the Modified Series that October. However, an accident suffered on the track would keep him laid up in a hospital bed for a month, and upon returning to the sport, he was never really the same driver he previously had been. By this point, the level of competition was higher than it had ever been, thanks in large part to a new crop of young moonshiners. Well, maybe not young. Lee Petty was 35 years old when he started racing, but he'd long been a moonshiner in North Carolina. He had been one of the men competing in that first NASCAR-sanctioned Strictly Stock series, driving a Buick Roadmaster he'd borrowed from his neighbor. The neighbor only allowed him to use the car because Petty assured him that the prize money would more than cover any damage that might occur to the car. Naturally, Petty had high hopes for big money, even bringing his son Richard to watch the race. But in the third turn, Petty flipped his car. And that was all she wrote for his dreams of victory in that race. But to his credit, Petty would recover and land a top 5 placement for the season, a feat he would duplicate for the next 10 seasons, in addition to becoming a 3-time champion of the Strictly Stock series, which would be renamed the Grand National Series, and would today be known as the Cup Series. And before long, Petty became one of the more recognizable drivers of the 1950s, alongside a fellow moonshiner named Robert Glenn Johnson Jr., who everyone simply knew as Junior Johnson. As a child, he had to climb over stacks of booze jars just to get to his bed because his family was so prolific in the moonshining trade. The Johnson house was actually getting raided often enough for moonshine that Junior's father spent nearly a third of his life in prison for it. And Junior himself would do a year behind bars, which took him out of racing from 1956 to 1957. But not because the cops ever caught him hauling alcohol in his car. No, this was over his operation of an illegal still, because the only way the law could capture Junior Johnson was to catch him while he was still. Pun intended. Sorry, I amuse myself. In 1955, Johnson would score a victory at Hickory Speedway in North Carolina. His first NASCAR win, leading 123 out of 200 laps, and he would claim 6 victories in the 1958 season. So that by 1959, he was widely regarded as one of the greatest short-track drivers in the sport, largely by developing a new skill he called drafting, in which he utilized the slipstream of the car in front of him to launch himself into the lead. I mentioned Junior Johnson and Lee Petty in particular because these were men who, similarly to many of our other cast of characters previously, come from a significant past in moonshining, yet were able to become foundational forces in NASCAR. These were men whose skill and talent were helping to build the audience that would propel NASCAR into the next generation and beyond. Yet Bill France was still considering ways to grow the fandom. He had succeeded at living his dream of racing Daytona, and had even become a promoter of Daytona. But he wanted Daytona to become a racing destination in the same way Indianapolis was. And he'd also realized that the beach course was not sustainable any longer due to the conditions and its inability to accommodate the growing crowds that the sport could now draw. And so, on April 14th, 1953, he proposed the construction of a new home track for Daytona Beach races, coming to an agreement with city and county officials the following August. However, ground clearing would not begin until November 1957, and groundbreaking would not occur until February 1958, meaning the first event at the track, nicknamed the World Center of Racing, wouldn't be held until February of 1959, but it would prove to be worth the wait. In a lot of ways, it was the culmination of a journey towards legitimacy for Bill France, for NASCAR, and for the sport of stock car racing itself. Following the 1-2 punch of race car driver Bill Vukovic's death at the 1955 Indy 500 and the 1955 tragedy at Le Mans in which over 80 people, including spectators, were killed, AAA refused to sanction these races any longer, dissolving their contest board entirely. So the United States Auto Club took AAA's place as sanctioning body. But the bad publicity had been a blow to the sport. So Bill France needed the inaugural Daytona International Speedway race to succeed. And it would, but not without controversy. Dubbed the Daytona 500, the event would include both hardtops and convertibles, marking the first and only time that convertibles were permitted in the race. Through rigorous promotional efforts and the natural allure of a new racetrack, the Daytona 500 drew over 41,000 fans to witness a race that ultimately came down to two hard-nosed veterans of the sport. Harlan, Iowa native Johnny Beauchamp, driving a Ford Thunderbird, and Lee Petty in an Oldsmobile Super 88. After trailing behind Ed Fireball Roberts for much of the race, Petty and Beauchamp took the lead after a fuel pump failure pulled Roberts out of the running. For the last 30 laps of the race, Petty and Beauchamp were neck and neck, and it looked for a time like Johnny Beauchamp would clinch the victory. But with 3 laps remaining, Petty pulled ahead. Now, to say Petty had a confident lead would be a bit of a misrepresentation, because Beauchamp was virtually side by side with him. As they rushed towards the finish line, they looked to be virtually overlapping, with a third car not far behind. Lee Petty was in the number 42 car, while Johnny Beauchamp was driving number 73. The third car, number 48, was driven by Joe Weatherly, but because Weatherly was 2 laps behind, he was not win competitive, but he still played spoiler in a way, because as it would later be theorized, Joe Weatherly's car was blocking Bill France's view of the finish. You can't really make him out in the photo, but Bill France is right there at the finish line. But between Joe Weatherly's presence and the simple fact that these cars were moving extraordinarily fast, it was hard to tell in that moment just who had won. After an exhausting race lasting 3 hours and 41 minutes, a decision was made. Johnny Beauchamp had just won the Daytona 500. Lee Petty was incredulous. He felt he'd won, and wasn't sure why there was any debate about it when his car was clearly ahead. Johnny Beauchamp would claim, quote, "I had him by 2 feet. I glanced over to Lee Petty's car as I crossed the finish line, and I could see his headlight slightly back of my car. It was so close I didn't know how they would call it, but I thought I won." End quote. Petty wasn't having it. He declared, quote, "I had Beauchamp by a good 2 feet. In my own mind, I know I won." End quote. The final result was thrown into dispute, and Bill France had to be the one to settle it. For his part, Fireball Roberts supported Petty's version of events. After he had to retire from the race due to the fuel pump failure, he'd made his way over to the finish line to watch the end of the race. He was right there when the cars crossed. He said, quote, "There's no doubt about it. Petty won." End quote. But it would take Bill France 3 days of combing over finish line photographs and footage taken by newsreel cameras in order to reach a decision. And as this was happening, the popularity of NASCAR was increasing by the day because the drama surrounding the contested finish kept the Daytona 500 on the front page of newspapers for those 3 days. People were waiting to find out who won, like a kid waiting for Christmas morning, unaware that while Santa brought them every single thing they asked for, Mom and Dad sort of forgot to buy batteries for any of it. Whether you were Team Beauchamp or Team Petty, Somebody was going to be disappointed by the decision. When the final call was made, the decision was in favor of Lee Petty, who was officially declared the winner of the very first Daytona 500. Petty would theorize that Big Bill knew he'd won as soon as the race ended, but declared in favor of Beauchamp in order to whip up controversy for the newspapers. As Petty would say years later, quote, "France would have done anything to generate publicity for his racetracks." End quote. And it worked. The Daytona 500 became an annual event, and arguably the most anticipated of the NASCAR season, hell, of the motorsports season in general. And the following year was even bigger, seeing the field grow from 59 cars to 68. Over 38,000 fans filled the speedway to watch the second annual race, won by a guy who, not too long before, had been doing time in jail. A man who used his brand new drafting technique to clinch the win. Starting from 9th position in his 1959 Chevrolet, Junior Johnson would claim the Daytona 500 victory. Among the people he defeated in the race were Lee Petty, who finished 4th, and his son, Richard Petty, who finished 3rd, both driving 1960 Plymouths. Fans were hooked, and while it would still be another decade before major, non-automotive related sponsors got in on the fun, the back-to-back successes of those first two Daytona 500s arguably solidified NASCAR as the modern arena for racing grid gladiators, and set the course for its cultural dominance in the decades to come. Influence carries with it the weight of mythology, and these men became part of the NASCAR folklore, each one etched into a larger narrative of a sport that is a uniquely American institution. Their stories over the preceding decades followed a mixture of triumph and tragedy, legacy and loss. Red Byron raced as long as his health would allow him, and even after he retired from racing full-time, he still worked on race cars and occasionally drove when opportunity would allow. In 1960, Byron managed an open-wheel racing team in the Sports Car Club of America, and it led to him considering the possibility of following in the footsteps of Raymond Parks and starting his own race team. He even had a plan to fund it with money from alcohol, albeit a legitimate, legal source, Missouri-based brewing company Anheuser-Busch. In fact, he checked into a hotel in Chicago to meet with their representatives when, on November 11, 1960, he suffered a heart attack in his hotel room. Red Byron, a war hero and NASCAR's first champion, died at age 45. In 2018, 58 years after his death, Red Byron would be elected to the NASCAR Hall of Fame. The same year of Byron's death, his old teammate Roy Hall had his final race, ending his career at Lakewood Speedway, the track that made he and his late cousin Lloyd C. among stock car racing's first true superstars. After a bright start, Hall crashed during the race and was unable to finish, and that was it for his racing career. And although his racing career lacked a poignant sports movie ending, Roy Hall was immortalized by the great folk singer Jim Croce in his 1972 song, Rapid Roy, That Stock Car Boy. After his career ended, Hall remained in Atlanta and eventually became a dealer, not for liquor, but for cars. He remained a figure of Atlanta's automotive dealer network until his death on March 14, 1991, at the age of 71, having lived by his old motto, "When it's time to go, I'll go. Until then, I have nothing to lose." Hall's death came exactly 1 week to the day after the passing of his fellow teammate, master mechanic Red Vogt, who passed away on March 7th at age 86. In 2002, both Roy Hall and Red Vogt would be elected to the Georgia Racing Hall of Fame. For his part, Big Bill France remained CEO of NASCAR until his retirement in 1972, having succeeded in smoothing out the rough edges of NASCAR's past and transforming it from something that took place on dirt tracks with drivers sourced from bootlegging to a family-friendly sport that could attract ticket-paying fans, huge ad dollars, and, starting in 1971, a live television audience. Yet Big Bill would, sadly, face a struggle familiar to all too many Americans, as he suffered from Alzheimer's disease in his later life. He lived to see his induction into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame and the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 1990. But on June 7, 1992, Big Bill France passed away at his Florida home at the age of 82. In 2010, he was part of the inaugural class of the NASCAR Hall of Fame, alongside his son, fellow race car driver and NASCAR executive Bill France Jr., who'd taken over the family business. Bill Jr. passed away from cancer in 2007, and today NASCAR's CEO is Big Bill's other son, Jim France. Lee Petty would attempt to repeat his victory at Daytona, culminating in a qualifying race for the 1961 Daytona 500. During the race, he came up against old rival Johnny Beauchamp to a far less favorable outcome, as Beauchamp lost control of his car and hit Petty's, sending both men into the guardrail, injuring a spectator and leaving Petty clinging to life in a hospital where he would be in recovery for 4 months. Petty would return to race car driving, but only for 3 more years, taking his final laps in 1964, having already cemented himself as one of the most well-regarded drivers to ever compete in NASCAR. He would take his knowledge as a driver and found a new racing team, Petty Enterprises, which kind of sounds like a great name for a drama channel. He would do this alongside his sons, future NASCAR Hall of Famers, Maurice Petty, and a name that would arguably become even bigger than his, Richard Petty. Fueled by the family's tenacity, Petty Enterprises would become one of the most successful teams in NASCAR history, and create a dynasty that would include both Maurice and Richard, as well as Kyle Petty, the tragically short-lived Adam Petty, and Dale Inman. He would join the International Motorsports Hall of Fame, the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America, the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame, and the NASCAR Hall of Fame, although he wouldn't live to see this latter induction. On April 5, 2000, Lee Petty would pass away at age 86. Raymond Parks didn't remain in racing as an owner, leaving by the mid-1950s, and instead getting into a host of different real estate businesses, from convenience stores to gas stations to liquor stores, appropriately enough. The legal kind, actually. While no longer an owner, he would remain a part of the racing community, befriending drivers like Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt. In fact, Parks was a guest of Earnhardt's at the 2001 Daytona 500, and was in his private box when the crash occurred that claimed Earnhardt's life. But in the aftermath of such a tragic loss was a temporary reprieve when Parks was among the inaugural inductees to the Georgia Racing Hall of Fame the following year, joining a class that included Red Byron and his cousin Lloyd C. Parks would be inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in 2017, 7 years after his death, at age 96. He was the last living member of the group that met at the Streamline Hotel 63 years earlier. NASCAR might never have happened without that meeting, and that meeting would never have happened without Parks's funding, and that funding never would have materialized without the moonshine that brought him his fortune. Lastly, Junior Johnson claimed 50 victories in his NASCAR career before his retirement in 1966. He would form his own team, Junior Johnson and Associates, and rival Petty Enterprises on the all-time list of winningest teams. In 1973, Jeff Bridges would play Johnson on the big screen in the film The Last American Hero, which featured the hit song I Got a Name by Jim Croce. Wait, how is Jim Croce in this twice? Oh no, that's great. Love me some Jim Croce. Time in a Bottle is elite. But perhaps the most fascinating element of his story is the presidential pardon he received in 1986 from President Ronald Reagan, clearing him of his 1956 conviction for moonshining. One of the most successful and celebrated owners in the history of NASCAR, Junior Johnson would be vindicated in light of everything he'd done to progress motorsports. Johnson would sell his team in the 90s and retire from ownership, although he would stay connected in the racing community like so many of his peers. He would pass away in hospice care in 2019 at age 88. Like Bill France, he had suffered from Alzheimer's disease. However, in the 12 years prior to his death, Johnson poked fun at his own moonshining past, partnering with a distiller who, in May 2007, was North Carolina's sole licensed distillery, and together they released a legal interpretation of his family's famous moonshine, called Midnight Moon. Johnson never shied away from his past as a moonshiner. For example, by the time he was 14 in 1945, Johnson had already perfected a move that he hadn't exactly invented, but a move that had become one of his signatures. The bootleg turn. Hell, one time he even tricked police into letting him through a blockade by mounting a light and a siren to the front of his car. Johnson was part of the inaugural NASCAR Hall of Fame class, and as part of his exhibit, a still was included to honor the origins of Junior Johnson and of the sport he loved, as he'd once famously declared, quote, "Moonshiners put more time, energy, thought, and love into their cars than any racer ever will." End quote. NASCAR is clean family entertainment for the most part, and incredibly lucrative with all the sponsors and all the personalities, drawing in new fans every year. But NASCAR never truly shed its outlaw soul, even if they paved over the dirt on which it was born. There was no separating NASCAR from the moonshine and motor oil that birthed it, nor the promoters, the drivers, the heroes, and the moments that secured NASCAR as an American institution. Baseball is the national pastime, and football is America's game. But NASCAR is a part of American myth-making, home to family dynasties, generational stories, and mechanical boundary pushing. In that way, its outlaw origins and domestic destiny reveal a fiercely, uniquely American spirit that seeks a never-ending westward passage to glory. Thank you so much for watching. If RCR brings any sort of value to your week at all, please consider leaving a comment, sharing the video, or even subscribing. I've also included a playlist of the very best of RCR stories that you can click on in the description or during the end card at the very end of the video. And be sure, if you subscribe, to treat that bell icon like a shift lever seconds before hitting a bootleg turn. But if you love RCR stories and want me to make more of these videos, Patreon is the absolute best way to allow me to keep making these long-form automotive videos on the main channel. You'll even get them early, along with other exclusive content you'll never see here. Thank you so much for supporting RCR with your viewership. And let me know what you think in the comments. Have a great rest of your week.